Chosen one, I have an urgent and important message to share today. This message is not for everyone. If you are not walking the divine path of God, if your heart resists truth, you may feel uncomfortable here. But if you are a true follower, if you have been set apart, then listen carefully, because this message reached you at the exact moment heaven intended. Nothing about this is accidental. God timed this encounter for your protection, your clarity, and your peace. There were conversations you never heard, plans made quietly, smiles worn loudly. Things were arranged behind your back with the intention to slow you down, confuse you, or push you out of alignment. But here is the truth they never saw coming. While they were planning in secret, you were changing spiritually, and that one shift destroyed everything they tried to build against you. What you are about to hear will explain strange resistance, sudden distance, and why certain doors closed without explanation. Stay with me till the end, because clarity is coming, and clarity brings rest to the soul. Before we continue, chosen ones, give a like to this video, subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, tap the bell icon, and share this message with other chosen ones so they can be part of this divine alignment. And comment 777 in the comments to declare that you are fully aligned with the mission God has placed on your life. The hidden plot. What they did in secret. Chosen one, let me speak to you calmly now, because what I am about to reveal is not meant to stir fear. It is meant to bring understanding. Some of the deepest attacks against God's chosen never happen in open confrontation. They happen in quiet places, in whispers, in subtle agreements, in rooms you were never invited into, yet strangely felt the effects of afterward. There were people who smiled at you, prayed with you, laughed with you, and still carried intentions that were not pure. Not everyone who walks beside you walks with you. And God allowed you to sense this, not so you would accuse, but so you would awaken. You felt the shift before you understood it. Conversations changed. Support faded. Energy felt different. You began questioning yourself, wondering if you were imagining things. You were not. Behind your back, narratives were created. Your silence was misinterpreted. Your focus was misunderstood. Your obedience to God threatened those who live comfortably in compromise. So they talked, they planned, they assumed you would never find out. And in a way you didn't, not with your ears but with your spirit. And that is far more powerful. Understand this clearly. The enemy rarely attacks chosen ones directly at first. He uses delay. He uses confusion, he uses isolation, he plants seeds of doubt through familiar faces. That is why the betrayal hurt so deeply. It did not come from strangers. It came from proximity. That pain you felt was not weakness. It was discernment, awakening. Some people secretly hoped you would fail. Others quietly worked to make sure you were excluded, overlooked, or misunderstood. Doors were influenced. Words were twisted. Your name was mentioned in rooms you never stepped into. But listen to me closely now. Nothing they planned was greater than the covering already placed over your life. God showed me this long ago. When someone cannot stop the calling on your life, they attempt to contaminate the environment around you. They hope the pressure will break you. They assume emotional exhaustion will make you quit. They count on you reacting instead of trusting. That was the plan, to wear you down slowly, not destroy you suddenly. And for a moment it almost worked. You felt tired in ways sleep could not fix. You felt misunderstood even when you explained yourself. You felt alone, even in crowds. But what they didn't realize is this. Chosen ones are refined in silence. When noise is removed, God speaks louder. The spiritual attack did not come with fire and chaos. It came with subtle resistance, delays that made no sense, favor that seemed to pause, relationships that suddenly shifted. And in that space, the enemy whispered lies, that you were doing too much, that you were not doing enough, that God had forgotten you, but heaven was watching every move. Let me free your mind right now. If they talked about you, it was because your presence disrupted their comfort. If they planned against you, it was because your obedience exposed what they were hiding. Darkness never attacks what it can control. It attacks what threatens its existence. Some of them never intended to harm you openly. They simply wanted to redirect you, to soften your convictions, to slow your obedience, to make you more manageable. That is why the attacks felt confusing rather than violent. But God never allowed confusion to become your identity. He allowed it to become your training ground. Every time you chose peace instead of reaction, something shifted in the spirit. Every time you prayed instead of explaining yourself, something broke off. You thought you were being passive. Heaven saw you being powerful. You were learning restraint, and restraint is authority under control. Let me tell you something that will bring you rest. The plans made behind your back were already known by God before they were spoken by man. Nothing caught him by surprise. Not one conversation, not one hidden intention, not one whispered agreement escaped his awareness. And that is why those plans never fully manifested. They underestimated one thing: your alignment. While they were busy strategizing, you were unknowingly drawing closer to God. While they were distracted by comparison, you were being shaped in character. While they expected you to break, you were being strengthened quietly. Chosen one, the reason you are still standing is not because the plan was weak. It is because the covering was strong. God did not expose everything to you because he did not need you to fight. He needed you to trust. And trust is what frustrated the enemy the most. You are not behind. You were never outmatched. You were simply being moved out of environments that could no longer contain what God was about to do through you. The hidden plot was never about your destruction. It was about your elevation through separation. And now, with clear eyes and a calm spirit, you can see it for what it truly was. This was not betrayal meant to end you. It was revelation meant to awaken you. Why you were the target. The burden of being chosen. Chosen one. Let me answer the question you asked God in silence. The question you whispered late at night when your heart felt heavy and confused. Why me? Why did they focus on me? Why did things shift when I was only trying to do what was right? This is where understanding replaces confusion, and peace replaces self-doubt. You were not targeted because you were weak. You were targeted because you were marked. Long before people noticed you, heaven did. Long before you understood your calling, God placed a distinction on your spirit. Chosen ones carry a weight that others cannot see, but can feel. And when people feel what they cannot explain, they react in one of two ways. They either learn from it, or they try to resist it. Your presence made people uncomfortable without you saying a word. Your integrity exposed shortcuts. Your obedience highlighted compromise. Your quiet discipline revealed laziness. You did not accuse anyone. You did not call anyone out. Yet simply by being who God called you to be, you revealed what others were trying to hide from themselves. And that is why the resistance began. Let me speak clearly here. Not everyone wants to grow. Not everyone wants truth. Many people want comfort more than transformation, and chosen ones disrupt comfort. You ask deeper questions. You move with intention. You refuse to blend in spiritually. Even when you tried to stay small, your spirit would not allow it. That internal push you felt was God reminding you that you were not designed to live beneath your calling. This is the burden of being chosen. You see things others ignore. You feel things others suppress. You cannot fake peace. You cannot live divided. That is why shallow environments exhaust you. That is why surface-level connections drain you. God wired you for depth, and depth threatens systems built on appearance. Some people did not hate you personally. They hated what you represented. Discipline, conviction, growth, truth. They saw in you what they once wanted to be, but abandoned along the way. And instead of returning to that path, they tried to silence the reminder. That reminder was you. You wondered why you were misunderstood even when your intentions were pure, why your kindness was questioned, why your silence was misread. This happens when you are chosen. Your motives are judged through broken lenses. People project their own struggles onto you because they cannot process your clarity. Let me remove the lie from your mind right now. You were not too intense. You were not too spiritual. You were not too focused. You were aligned, and alignment feels extreme to those who live in compromise. When light enters a room, darkness does not negotiate. It reacts. God often allows chosen ones to be misunderstood early because clarity too soon can interfere with character development. If everyone understood you immediately, you would never learn humility. If everyone supported you immediately, you would never learn discernment. The isolation was not abandonment. It was refinement. Think about this. The pressure you faced forced you to pray deeper. The rejection pushed you closer to God. The confusion trained you to listen to His voice instead of public opinion. What felt like resistance was actually redirection. God was narrowing your path so your purpose could not be diluted. You carry something rare, and rare things are always tested. Gold is tested by fire, faith is tested by silence, calling is tested by opposition. God does not waste suffering. Every moment that made you question yourself was shaping you into someone who would no longer need validation. This is why the attacks were subtle. The enemy knew loud opposition would awaken you too quickly, so he tried to exhaust you emotionally. He tried to make you doubt your perception. He tried to convince you that you were imagining things. But discernment cannot be erased once activated. You were the target because your obedience was dangerous to darkness. You were the target because your future impact is greater than your present visibility. You were the target because God trusted you with pressure that would have crushed others. And even when you felt weak, heaven saw strength forming. Let me tell you something gently now. The burden of being chosen is heavy at first, but it becomes light when you understand it. You stop asking why me, and you start saying thank you for trusting me. You stop trying to fit in, and you start standing firm. You stop shrinking, and you start resting in who you are. God never promised chosen ones an easy path. He promised them a protected one. And protection does not always look like comfort. Sometimes it looks like separation. Sometimes it looks like delay. Sometimes it looks like being misunderstood while God works behind the scenes. Chosen one, you were not targeted because you were doing something wrong. You were targeted because you were doing something right. And now that you see this clearly, the weight begins to lift. Understanding brings peace, and peace prepares you for what comes next. You were never cursed. You were called. The turning point. When heaven stepped in. Chosen one, there comes a moment in every divine journey when heaven intervenes quietly. Not with thunder, not with public announcements, but with precision. This was the moment you did not recognize at first. You only felt it afterward, when things that should have gone wrong didn't. When plans that were clearly moving against you suddenly lost momentum. When chaos that was building around you dissolved without explanation. This is where God stepped in. You see, there is a limit to what darkness is allowed to do to a chosen one. God watches patiently, not because He is absent, but because He is strategic. He allows certain pressures so your discernment sharpens, your faith deepens, and your dependence on Him becomes unshakable. But when the line is about to be crossed, heaven responds. And when heaven responds, it does not negotiate. Think back carefully. There was a season where things almost collapsed. A relationship, a position, your emotional stability, your confidence. You felt like you were walking on thin ground. One wrong step, and everything could have fallen apart. And yet somehow, you were held, supported by something you could not see. That was not luck. That was intervention. God has a way of disrupting harmful plans without exposing you to unnecessary trauma. He redirects conversations. He delays decisions. He causes confusion among those who plotted. He moves people out of alignment with their own intentions. Suddenly, things stop making sense for them. While you are praying quietly, they are scrambling without clarity. This is something many chosen ones misunderstand. Divine intervention does not always look like immediate victory. Sometimes, it looks like delay. A delay that frustrates the enemy more than it frustrates you. Because delay keeps you safe while wearing them out. Delay creates distance between you and the trap. Delay buys time for alignment. There were moments when you thought God was silent. But silence was not absence. Silence was concealment. God was hiding you from outcomes you were never meant to experience. If you had known everything that was being planned, fear might have pulled you out of position. So God covered your eyes while He handled the situation. Let me tell you something powerful. When God steps in, He does not just stop the attack. He rearranges the environment. People begin to reveal themselves without you confronting them. Support systems change. Doors close that you were emotionally attached to. And at the time it feels confusing, even painful. But later, you realize those doors were leading you into places that would have drained you. You may have noticed this. Certain people drifted away naturally. Conversations became shorter. Access to you was reduced without effort. That was not rejection. That was protection. God was shrinking your circle to protect your spirit. He was removing interference so your next season could arrive clean. There is also something else God does at this turning point. He strengthens your inner world. While external circumstances remain uncertain, your inner peace begins to grow. You stop reacting the way you used to. Things that once triggered you no longer have the same effect. You begin choosing silence over explanation, rest over resistance, prayer over panic. That shift was heaven stepping in. The enemy plans on emotional reactions. He feeds on fear, anger, and insecurity. When you stopped reacting, the entire strategy weakened. You did not realize it at the time, but your calm was warfare. Your restraint was disruption. Your obedience confused everything that was built against you. There were also moments of divine redirection. You were prevented from saying certain things. You felt a strong urge to walk away instead of confront. You sensed that explaining yourself would not bring peace. That was wisdom, not weakness. God was guiding your responses to protect the outcome. Chosen one, God often intervenes by changing you before changing the situation. Because when you change, the situation loses power over you. What once felt heavy begins to feel small. What once felt threatening begins to feel irrelevant. That is authority forming. Some of the plans against you failed simply because you were no longer accessible. Not emotionally, not spiritually, not mentally. You stopped giving people the version of you they could manipulate. You grew, quietly, without announcement, and growth is the most dangerous thing to darkness. There were moments when you almost stepped out of alignment, when frustration whispered, "Just react this once. Just defend yourself. Just expose them." But something in you held back. That was not hesitation. That was God restraining you from actions that would delay your elevation. Heaven is not impressed by public victories. Heaven is impressed by obedience under pressure. When God steps in, He also restores your clarity. Suddenly, things make sense. You look back and connect dots you could not see before. You realize that certain losses were escapes, certain disappointments were redirections, certain endings were protection disguised as pain. You were not abandoned in that season. You were being escorted through it. And here is the part that brings peace to the soul. God did not intervene because you were perfect. He intervened because you were sincere. You kept seeking Him even when you did not understand Him. You kept trusting even when the outcome was unclear. That posture invited heaven's involvement. The turning point is rarely dramatic. It is subtle. It is internal. It is the moment you stop feeling desperate. The moment you stop chasing validation. The moment you say, God, I trust you even if nothing changes today. That surrender shifts everything. After that point, the plans against you no longer had access to your spirit. They may have continued trying, but the power was gone. Because power does not come from position. It comes from alignment. And you were aligned. Chosen one, heaven stepped in the moment you chose faith over fear, restraint over reaction, and trust over control. You may not have seen it immediately, but now you can feel the result. The weight has lifted, the fog has cleared, the urgency to prove yourself is gone. That is how you know God intervened. And what happened next is what they never anticipated. Then you did this. The move that shook everything. Chosen one, this is where everything changed. Not because you raised your voice, not because you exposed anyone, not because you fought back the way the world fights. What you did was far more powerful and far more threatening to the plans made against you. You chose alignment over reaction. While they were expecting confrontation, you chose calm. While they were waiting for you to defend yourself, you chose silence. While they assumed pressure would break you, you leaned deeper into God. And that single decision, made quietly, without announcement, shook everything they had planned. This is something very few people understand. Spiritual battles are not won by force. They are won by positioning. And you repositioned yourself without even realizing the full weight of what you were doing. You stopped trying to be understood by people who had already decided not to understand you. You stopped explaining your heart to ears that were committed to misunderstanding it. That was the move. When you stopped reacting emotionally, the enemy lost leverage. Because emotional access is how manipulation works. Once that access is gone, the strategy collapses. You didn't give them what they wanted. You didn't play the role assigned to you. And that confused everything. You see, they had studied your old patterns. They knew how you used to respond. They expected you to defend yourself, to confront, to react, to get emotional. That was the version of you their plan was built around. But God upgraded you in the middle of the attack. So when the moment came, they were facing someone they no longer recognized. You became still, and stillness is dangerous to chaos. Let me say this clearly. Silence, when guided by God, is not weakness. It is strategy. You didn't go quiet because you were afraid. You went quiet because you were listening. You stopped speaking to people and started hearing God more clearly. That shift alone disrupted everything. You also did something else. You kept growing while they were watching you struggle. You kept learning. You kept maturing. You kept healing. And healing is a threat to anyone who benefits from your pain. The moment you stopped carrying resentment, the moment you released bitterness, the moment you refused to become hardened, that's when their influence ended. They expected wounds. They got wisdom. They expected you to shrink. You expanded internally. They expected exhaustion. You found rest. Chosen one, this is where heaven smiled. Because what you did next was obedience. Simple obedience. You stayed on the path God gave you even when it was uncomfortable. You kept your character intact even when your name was being questioned. You refused to compromise your integrity just to prove a point. That is rare, and that is powerful. Understand this. Darkness plans based on predictable behavior, but obedience makes you unpredictable to the enemy. When you choose God's way instead of your emotions, strategies fall apart. Because the enemy cannot manipulate obedience, he can only observe it. There were moments when reacting would have felt justified, moments when speaking up would have felt fair, moments when defending yourself would have felt necessary. But something inside you held back. That wasn't fear. That was discernment. God was teaching you when to move and when to remain still. And in that stillness, something shifted in the spirit. You became untouchable in ways you don't fully understand yet. When you stopped chasing approval, approval began chasing you. When you stopped forcing doors, the right ones opened naturally. When you stopped explaining yourself, God began explaining you through outcomes. That is divine order. Let me tell you something important. The move that shook everything was not dramatic. It was subtle. It was internal. You aligned your heart with God instead of your emotions with people. That alignment changed your frequency, and when your frequency changes, access changes. Certain people could no longer reach you. Certain conversations could no longer affect you. Certain manipulations no longer worked. Not because they stopped trying, but because you were no longer available in the same way. You also stopped asking questions that kept you stuck. You stopped asking why they did this. You stopped asking what you did wrong. You stopped replaying conversations in your mind. Instead, you started asking God how to move forward. That shift alone moved you out of the trap. The enemy wanted you stuck in analysis. God moved you into action. Quiet action. Faith-filled action. Inner action. You forgave without reconciliation. You released without closure. You healed without apology from them. And that is when the power balance shifted completely, because unforgiveness binds you to the past. Forgiveness frees you for the future, and your future carries weight. Let me slow this down so it settles into your spirit. You did not win by overpowering them. You won by outgrowing them. You didn't defeat them by exposing their plan. You defeated them by becoming someone their plan could no longer touch. This is why things started falling apart for them afterward. Not because you cursed them, not because you wished harm, but because the assignment expired. They were operating with outdated information. They were fighting a version of you that no longer existed. God often upgrades chosen ones in the middle of attacks so the enemy never catches up. That's what happened here. You became emotionally disciplined, spiritually grounded, mentally clear. And that combination is unstoppable. You learned when to speak and when to remain silent, when to walk away and when to stand firm. That wisdom cannot be taken from you. There is something else you did that matters deeply. You trusted God with the outcome. You let go of control. You stopped trying to manage how justice would look. You trusted that God sees what you don't and handles what you can't. That trust invited divine intervention on a level you couldn't have achieved through effort alone. When you released the need to be vindicated publicly, God began working privately. And private work produces permanent results. Chosen one, this is why peace entered your life unexpectedly. This is why clarity followed confusion. This is why your spirit feels lighter now. You made a move that aligned you fully with heaven. And when heaven backs a move, no plan formed against it can stand. You didn't become cold. You became wise. You didn't become passive. You became discerning. You didn't lose your fire. You learned how to aim it. And that terrified everything that was built against you. Because now, you are no longer reacting to attacks. You are walking in authority. Quiet authority. Grounded authority. Authority that doesn't need to announce itself. Chosen one, what you did may have felt small at the time, but in the spiritual realm, it was seismic. You chose God's way over your own impulses, and that decision shifted timelines, altered outcomes, and dismantled strategies you were never meant to fight directly. This is why what happens next feels like reversal. This is why elevation follows. This is why the plans made behind your back could not survive the version of you that emerged. You didn't fight the battle. You outgrew it. When their plan collapsed, divine reversal. Chosen one, this is the part few people get to witness clearly. Not because it doesn't happen, but because God does it quietly. When their plan collapsed, it did not collapse with noise. It collapsed with confusion. It collapsed with silence. It collapsed because the power behind it was removed. Here is the truth you need to understand. The moment you stepped out of emotional reaction and into spiritual alignment, the plan against you lost its fuel. Darkness can only operate where there is access to your emotions, access to your fear, access to your need for validation. When those doors closed, the strategy began to fall apart on its own. They started experiencing resistance where they once had momentum. Things they thought were guaranteed suddenly became uncertain. Conversations that were supposed to work in their favor stopped producing results. Support they expected from others faded. Clarity left them. While you were gaining peace, they were losing direction. This is divine reversal. God does not always expose people publicly. Sometimes he simply removes his grace from their plans, and when grace is removed, effort becomes exhausting. Nothing flows, nothing aligns, everything feels heavy. That is what happens when someone builds against a chosen one instead of aligning with God's will. You may have noticed something subtle during this time. People who once had influence over your life suddenly had none. Their words no longer carried weight. Their opinions no longer disturbed your peace. Even when you heard things secondhand, they didn't land the same way. That is because God shifted the authority dynamic. Authority does not come from position, it comes from alignment. While they were trying to control outcomes, God was reshaping yours. While they were focused on appearances, God was focused on purpose, and purpose always outlives manipulation. There is something important I need you to hear. The collapse of their plan was not about punishing them, it was about protecting you. God is more concerned with your future than with proving a point. So instead of dramatic exposure, he chose separation. Instead of confrontation, he chose elevation. You were moved out of reach. Some people fell away naturally. Some opportunities disappeared quietly. Some environments no longer felt accessible. At the time, it may have felt like loss, but in reality, it was extraction. God was removing you from spaces where your spirit would have continued to be drained. Meanwhile, those who plotted began to experience internal unrest. Not necessarily guilt, but disorientation. The plan that once made sense no longer did. They couldn't figure out why things weren't working, and the more they tried to fix it, the more resistance they met. That is what happens when God steps in. Let me be very clear here. You did not cause their downfall. You did not need to. God does not require chosen ones to become agents of revenge. He requires them to remain aligned. Alignment triggers reversal automatically. Scripture shows us this pattern again and again. When God takes over a battle, the enemy turns on itself. Confusion replaces coordination. Pride replaces strategy. Effort replaces flow. That is exactly what happened. While they were scrambling, you were resting. While they were explaining, you were being elevated quietly. While they were trying to regain control, you were gaining clarity. This is the justice of God. Calm, precise, complete. You may never hear an apology. You may never receive acknowledgement. You may never see public accountability. And that is okay. Closure does not always come through conversation. Sometimes it comes through peace. Sometimes it comes through distance. Sometimes it comes through growth that makes the past irrelevant. God closed that chapter without asking for your permission because he knew you might have stayed out of loyalty. But loyalty to people who work against your calling is disobedience to God. So he intervened. Another sign of divine reversal is this. The things they tried to take from you were restored in a different form. Confidence returned, but deeper. Peace returned, but stronger. Joy returned, but quieter. You didn't go back to who you were. You became someone new. That is restoration. You also stopped seeking validation from places that once mattered to you. You no longer felt the need to prove your worth. You no longer chased recognition. You knew who you were. And when you know who you are, external approval becomes optional. That inner security is what sealed the reversal. Some of them may still speak about you, but notice this. Their words no longer shape your reality. They speak from a distance now, from a place of irrelevance. Because God relocated you spiritually, and distance is protection. Chosen one, divine reversal does not always look like immediate success. Sometimes it looks like peace in places where chaos used to live. Sometimes it looks like clarity where confusion once ruled. Sometimes it looks like being unbothered by things that once consumed your thoughts. That is victory. God did not just stop the plan, He used it. He used it to mature you, to refine you, to position you. What the enemy meant to distract you became the very thing that disciplined your spirit. And here is the part that should bring rest to your soul. Nothing like that will work on you the same way again, because now you see, now you discern, now you understand how spiritual attacks operate. And awareness is protection. The plan collapsed because it was built on a version of you that no longer exists. It depended on your emotional engagement. It depended on your confusion. It depended on your need to explain yourself. And all of that died in the process. You are calmer now, more grounded, less reactive. That is not exhaustion, that is authority. Some people lose battles loudly. Chosen ones win quietly. God reversed the situation not by lifting you above others publicly, but by lifting you above the influence they once had. And that is far more powerful, because influence determines outcomes. You no longer needed to watch your back. God became your rear guard. You no longer needed to defend your name. God became your defender. You no longer needed to manage perception. God handled positioning. Let this settle into your spirit. The collapse of their plan was not your responsibility. It was God's response to your obedience. You stayed in alignment. You stayed restrained. You stayed faithful. And heaven responded. What they intended for harm was neutralized. What they hoped would weaken you strengthened you. What they thought would delay you prepared you. That is divine reversal. And now, standing where you are with clarity and calm, you are ready for the next phase. Because the battle behind your back is over, and what lies ahead requires a different level of authority. You are no longer surviving. You are stepping forward. Who you are now. Stepping into authority. Chosen one, pause for a moment and feel this. You are not the same person you were when this journey began. Not emotionally,